Hey, how you doing? This is Adam Post. Rogue federal agency raided by U.S. Marshals for refusing access to Doge workers. Here's how this story started. Small federal agency blocks Doge employees from entering its building. The U.S. African Development Foundation denied several Doge employees access to its offices on Wednesday, as Doge makes sweeping eliminations across federal agencies. They thought they had it right as an independent agency to block other federal investigators from coming into their agency, even though the head of USAID, the acting head, said he wants Doge people in there to figure out exactly what's been going on. Here's how this turned out. Doge staff bring U.S. Marshals to small federal agency that denied them access. The show of force by Trump administration officials and federal law enforcement resulted in a frantic and traumatizing scene, according to several USADF officials. And that also sparked a lawsuit from the aid organization's leader claiming Doge officials are unauthorized to represent the agency. There's a power struggle going on between permanent Washington, the Washington class that feels entitled to do whatever they want to do with our money, and the elected leadership of the government, the new administration. But just to get some background, there's been questions about this agency before. From foreignpolicy.com, lawmakers accuse small U.S. aid agency of waste, fraud, and abuse. The U.S. African Development Foundation says it's cooperating fully with investigations. This article was from a year ago, March 2024, before the elections. What the organization is supposed to be doing is acting as a federal aid agency that invests directly in African businesses and development projects. Is there a way to steal from that? Is there a way to do some self-dealing and put money in your pockets? Well, if it's Washington, there's a way. And that's part of what the accusation was. Senator Jim Risch and Tim Scott in late January 2024 sent a letter to the U.S. Government Accountability Office, an independent government watchdog, urging a federal investigation into the organization. They urged the GAO to investigate, quote, misuse of official funds, fraudulent spending and record keeping, conflicts of interest among USADF management, board members, and private sector non-governmental partners, that's NGOs, gross mismanagement and inappropriate, abusive, and discriminatory management practices, as well as management efforts to suppress evidence of wrongdoing, according to a copy of the letter obtained by Foreign Policy. Those are two U.S. senators. After doing their own investigation, several employees of the U.S. DOGE service, the organization overseen by Elon Musk that is tasked with slashing the size of federal government, were blocked Wednesday afternoon from entering a small U.S. aid agency focused on African economic development. The standoff, which lasted about an hour at the headquarters of the organization in downtown Washington, is one of the latest acts of resistance from federal employees as DOGE subordinates attempt to access data systems and federal grants. They're trying to look at the grants that you guys have been sending out to your friends. The federal government has a right to look at what offices within the federal government are doing, even though they claim they're an independent agency, especially after past allegations of wrongdoing. That's taxpayer money these guys are playing with. And after that pushback and that nonsense, the DOGE staff, of course, are going to get in anyway because they're bringing U.S. Marshals to back them up. Employees of the U.S. DOGE service, the organization overseen by Elon Musk, successfully gained access to the U.S. African Development Foundation's headquarters in downtown Washington on Thursday, just one day later. DOGE officials returned to the organization's headquarters at 10:30, according to several agency officials with first-hand knowledge of the matter who spoke on the condition of anonymity to prevent. DOGE officials returned to the USADF offices at 10:30 a.m. in downtown Washington. Roughly an hour later, Pete Marocco, director of the State Department's Office of Foreign Assistance and acting deputy administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, arrived with 5 U.S. Marshals and a handful of DOGE employees, according to several USDAF staffers. Much like the scene on Wednesday, the group demanded access to the 10th floor where the foundation's offices are. The show of force by Trump administration officials and federal law enforcement resulted in a frantic, traumatizing scene, according to USADF officials. And that also triggered a federal lawsuit filed by the aid organization's leader against Trump, Marocco, and DOGE officials, claiming they're unauthorized to represent the agency and requesting an immediate intervention by the court. Quote, the United States African Development Foundation offices were entered today by Mr. Peter Marocco and others who we do not believe are authorized to represent the agency. USADF is fully complying with its statutory obligations. We will follow the law with the expectation that our staff will be treated with dignity and respect, he said. A federal judge imposed a pause Thursday evening, barring the Trump administration, Morocco, and DOGE officials from removing USADF President and CEO Ward Brem. U.S. District Judge Richard Leon issued an administrative stay until 5 p.m. on Tuesday to allow the court to deliberate on the lawsuit, given the significant statutory and constitutional issues involved. The order also stated that during this time, Brem may not be removed from his capacity as president of the agency, quote, absent a decision by the lawfully constituted board of USADF, nor obstructed from his duties, and that defendants may not appoint Morocco or recognize any other person as president or as an acting board member without Senate confirmation. In a statement to the Washington Post, a White House official tied the nature of the DOGE visit to an executive order issued on February 19th from President Donald Trump, eliminating, quote, unnecessary government entities and reducing their operations and personnel to the minimum presence and function required by law. And what that executive order calls for is not the elimination of this or any other agency. It calls for reducing the size of the agency to the size that is required by law for it to exist. So it should not be bigger or doing different things than are otherwise provided for by law. So if a law creates an agency and the law says that the agency should be doing this function and that function, and then all of a sudden, because it's been around for years and because they have sufficient funding and they get even more funding, they start doing other things outside even their authorized activity under law. That's not a problem until a president comes in and says, okay, we're going to slim down the government, so we're not going to be engaging in things that we're not legally authorized to do anymore. That's where a lot of these layoffs are coming from. Extra things that the agency doesn't have the responsibility to do, even under the law that created the agency. The White House continued, quote, President Trump signed an executive order to reduce the federal bureaucracy, which reduced the USDAF to its statutory minimum, and appointed Peter Morocco as acting chairman of the board. Entitled rogue bureaucrats have no authority to defy executive orders by the President of the United States or physically bar his representatives from entering the agencies they run. A USADF official, in response to the White House statement, told the Washington Post, quote, clearly this White House spokesperson doesn't know who Ward Brem is. He's hardly an entitled bureaucrat, having never worked for the government before he took his assignment. Ward is a well-known conservative Republican businessman from Minnesota who has volunteered as a board member for USADF for over 20 years. The entitlement is defined not by having worked in the federal government for a long time. It's the behavior. It's the behavior and the attitude that the federal government has no control over federal executive offices. And that if you determine you think you can, you'll just ignore everything the president says or does. And that's an entitled bureaucrat. According to agency officials, few USADF personnel were inside the office. Many chose to telework after Wednesday's standoff, when they were notified by fellow staffers who were having lunch nearby that DOGE officials and later Morocco and federal marshals were arriving on the premises. The staffers inside the office exited the building via stairwell, bypassing the elevators because of an ongoing power outage, leaving behind their personal belongings to avoid confrontation with DOGE employees and U.S. Marshals, according to USDAF officials. So they just ran out of the place and left their stuff. Sounds like they're not so tough when the U.S. Marshals come and raid their offices. As agency personnel waited outside and huddled together at a nearby business, some received calls from Nate Kavanaugh, the 28-year-old tech entrepreneur working with the U.S. DOGE service, who was on site and had claimed for a second day to be a USDF employee and requested employees return and grant him access to the computer systems. But no USADF officials returned to the office, a senior official said. That official also stated that the agency was aware that Morocco came down to dismantle the entire agency and fire all staff by accessing USDAF systems, canceling grants and contracts, and installing a reduction in force order. So by trying to lock them out of the computers, you think you're not going to get fired and they're not going to cancel contracts? Hours passed as DOGE employees remained inside the USADF headquarters before agency employees were instructed by leadership to return home. At 2:30 p.m., Brem, who was not in Washington, filed a lawsuit in the U.S. District Court of the District of Columbia to block DOGE from accessing USDAF and removing him as its president. Quote, without this court's immediate intervention, defendants will continue their tactics and strong-arm their way into USADF, no matter that USADF has a legally constituted board and president, the lawsuit stated, claiming that DOGE and Morocco exceeded their legal authority and are outright ignoring the law in their attempts to remove Plaintiff Brem and shut down USADF. DOGE officials were still inside the agency offices at 5 p.m., according to a USADF official who was in touch with an on-duty security guard at the building. USADF is a nonpartisan independent agency established through the African Development Foundation Act of 1980 with a mission to support and invest directly in African-owned and African-led enterprises that improve the lives and livelihoods of people in underserved communities in Africa, according to the agency's website. The U.S. statute that created the agency states that the foundation, quote, shall have perpetual succession unless dissolved by an act of Congress, underscoring that only congressional action and not an executive order can dissolve it, raising broader questions among legal experts about whether Trump's executive order to eliminate it and efforts by the U.S. DOGE service violate constitutional law. Quote, when Congress speaks, that is definitive under Article 1 of the Constitution. That is as true when it comes to ADF as any other agency, large or small, well-known or otherwise. Trump, Musk, and DOGE have been running rampant over legal limits. No wonder the courts have been stopping the administration at so many turns. The courts, of course, were extremely political in trying to stop the Trump administration, and in many cases, they did not stop the Trump administration, and the final decision about these kinds of things will be made at the Supreme Court. Though ultimately, just because a law is passed by Congress, that does not make it constitutional. That's why you need the Supreme Court to ultimately review these issues when there's a dispute. Unlike some other foreign aid agencies such as USAID, which employs thousands of federal workers, USADF is significantly smaller with only about 50 employees. It's operated by a board of directors whose 7 members are nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. The board of directors selects the USADF president and chief executive, currently Brem, who manages the day-to-day activities of the foundation. And Brem had this to say, if DOGE achieves its goal of shutting down USADF, we will feel the ripple effects across the African continent and in the United States. And it's possible that if what this agency does is so crucial and so important to the continent of Africa, that there shouldn't have been a lot of inappropriate behavior going on, as accused by these 2 senators. Let me know what you think of all this in the comments below. Always love to see your ideas. Please be sure you are subscribed to the channel. Click the bell for notifications, give me a thumbs up, and I'll see you again soon with another story. And if I don't see you, I will miss you.